When a storm rages and a mechanic sees a stranded driver on the roadside, there's no second thought, just a simple act of kindness. No name, no payment, just help. But within 24 hours, a mechanic will lose everything. And the man unknowingly saved? Michael Jordan. What happens next will prove that one moment of selflessness can change a life forever. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The storm raged like an untamed beast, slashing the highway with sheets of relentless rain. Wind howled through the darkness, bending trees and rattling street signs as lightning carved jagged streaks across the sky. The road ahead was barely visible, a blurry mess of rain-streaked asphalt illuminated by the occasional flicker of headlights. Michael Jordan gripped the steering wheel of his sleek custom Bentley, his jaw tightening as the tires hissed against the flooded pavement. He had driven through bad weather before, but this storm was something else. Violent, unpredictable, and eerily quiet between bursts of thunder. The GPS had already failed him twice, recalibrating endlessly, as if just as lost as he was. The evening had started smoothly, an exclusive charity gala at a private estate outside Chicago, handshakes with politicians, heartfelt speeches about giving back. But now, alone on this desolate stretch of highway, soaked in silence and storm, none of that seemed to matter. He just wanted to get home. Then, it happened. A sudden, jolting thump beneath the car. The Bentley shuddered as the dashboard lit up in an angry sea of red warning signals. The steering grew heavy, sluggish. A flat tire, of all the nights. Michael let out a slow breath, carefully guiding the car onto the narrow shoulder. He checked his phone. No signal. Fantastic. He exhaled sharply, rolling his shoulders. Changing a tire wasn't beyond him, but in this rain? He was already drenched just from stepping outside to confirm the damage. Water streamed down his face, soaking his tailored suit as he squinted at the deflated tire. Even if he did manage to get the spare out, he wasn't sure about the jack points on this model. He popped the trunk, feeling frustration claw at him. He wasn't used to feeling helpless. A pair of headlights cut through the rain, approaching from the opposite direction. A truck, an older model, slowing down. Michael stepped back, half expecting it to speed past. Most people did. No one wanted to get involved with a stranger on a night like this. But instead, the truck came to a complete stop. The driver's side door opened. A man stepped out, his silhouette tall and broad, hood pulled over his head against the rain. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The storm filled the silence between them, the rain hitting the asphalt like tiny bullets. Then, the man called out, "Need some help?" Michael hesitated. He had money, connections. Yet at this moment, soaked to the bone with no cell service, he was just a guy stuck in the rain like anyone else. "Yeah," he admitted. "Flat tire. I was trying to change it, but this rain isn't helping." The man walked closer, pulling his hood back slightly. Rough features, exhausted eyes, work-worn hands. "Let me take a look," he said simply. Michael stepped aside as the stranger knelt by the wheel, running his fingers along the rim, assessing the damage with a practiced eye. "You got a spare?" "Yeah, in the trunk," Michael said. The man nodded, walking over and lifting the compartment cover with the ease of someone who had done this 100 times. Michael watched as the guy worked, his movements quick and methodical, like muscle memory. He wasn't fumbling in the rain, wasn't hesitating, just fixing the problem. After a few minutes, Michael spoke up. "You're good at this." The man shrugged as he wiped rain from his face. "Been a mechanic since I was 16. My dad taught me." Michael watched him work, intrigued. This guy had no idea who he was. No cameras, no autographs, no scripted pleasantries. Just a man helping another man. Lightning flashed across the sky as the last lug nut was tightened. The stranger stood, brushing his wet hands against his jeans. "You're all set." Michael looked down at the newly fixed tire, then back at the man. "Appreciate it. Let me pay you for your time." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a stack of $100 bills. The man hesitated only for a second before shaking his head. "No need." Michael frowned. "Come on, man. It's the least I can do." But the man held up a calloused hand, firm but not unkind. Just help someone else someday. Michael stared at him, caught off guard. He had spent decades in a world where money was the solution to every problem. And yet, here was a guy, soaked, exhausted, looking like he could use the cash, turning it down. Michael slipped the money back into his pocket. "What's your name?" The man wiped rain from his brow. "Jace." "Jace." Carter Jace gave a small nod before turning and heading back to his truck. Michael watched as the red taillights disappeared into the storm, leaving him standing in the rain, something unsettled stirring in his chest. For the first time in years, Michael Jordan had been helped by someone who had no idea who he was. And the strangest part? It felt good. Shaking off the thought, Michael climbed back into his Bentley, turning on the wipers and gripping the wheel. He was ready to put this night behind him. But he had no way of knowing that in less than 24 hours, Jace Carter would lose everything. And that simple act of kindness? It would come back around in ways neither of them could have ever imagined. The windshield wipers slid back and forth in a steady rhythm, but Michael Jordan barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, trapped in the moment that had just passed. He had driven away, the Bentley gliding smoothly down the highway, but his thoughts stayed behind, stuck with the stranger who had just helped him for nothing in return. Jace Carter. Michael flexed his fingers on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the empty road ahead. He had met thousands of people in his lifetime, teammates, coaches, executives, fans, even strangers in passing. But almost every interaction had come with an expectation. People always wanted something from him: a signature, a handshake, a donation, a sponsorship, something. Jace, though? He had looked him in the eye, fixed his car, and turned down a wad of cash like it was nothing more than spare change. Michael had been in enough business meetings to recognize a man who needed the money. Jace's hands had been rough from years of work, his clothes worn but clean, his exhaustion visible beneath the rain. Yet, he had walked away. No hesitation. No regret. Just 6 words. Just help someone else someday. Michael turned onto the private road leading to his estate, still unsettled by the interaction. He tried to push it from his mind, but it wouldn't let go. It wasn't just the refusal of money, it was the authenticity behind it. He parked, cutting the engine. Rain drummed against the hood of the car as he leaned back, exhaling slowly. He had a dozen emails waiting for him, business decisions that needed his attention, and yet his mind drifted somewhere entirely different. Back home. Back to North Carolina. His childhood home had been small but full of love. His parents had worked tirelessly to provide for him and his siblings, and Michael had grown up watching them stretch every dollar, making sure their kids never felt the struggle they carried. He remembered the days when they barely had enough, when they relied on the kindness of neighbors. The local shop owner who had once given his mother groceries on credit, knowing she would pay when she could. The coach who had bought him his first real pair of basketball shoes, believing in a kid before the world ever did. The teacher who had stayed after school to help him with assignments, refusing to let him fall behind. Back then, every act of kindness had mattered. Michael rubbed a hand down his face, exhaling. Maybe that was why Jace's refusal felt so heavy. It reminded him of a time when he had nothing. He sighed, finally grabbing his keys and stepping into the rain. Inside, his house was quiet, dimly lit by security lights. He toed off his wet shoes, moving toward the kitchen, where a sleek fridge hummed softly. He wasn't hungry, but he grabbed a bottle of water and leaned against the counter, letting the storm rage outside. He should have just left the thought behind on the highway. But he knew himself too well. He would have to know more. Michael reached for his phone and dialed a familiar number. After 2 rings, a crisp voice answered. "Mr. Jordan? Diana, I need you to look into someone for me." By the time he pulled into the parking lot of the Maplewood Apartments, his hands were stiff from the cold, and his mind was already back on the next problem to solve. Rent was due in a few days, and even though he had been pulling extra shifts, it still wouldn't be enough. Alara's school needed fees paid. His truck needed repairs. Everything always needed something. He killed the engine, staring at the faded sign above the apartment entrance. He had lived here for years, but it had never felt permanent. It was a place to survive, not a place to grow. He grabbed his toolbox from the back seat, stepping into the rain. It was late, but the warm glow of a single light in his window told him Alara was still awake. When he unlocked the door, the smell of chicken soup hit him first, then the sound of an old TV playing a rerun of some game show. Mrs. Chen, their elderly neighbor, sat on the couch, knitting. "You're late," she said, not looking up. "Yeah," Jace sighed, setting his tools down. "Got caught in the storm." Mrs. Chen glanced at him over her glasses. "Alara's been waiting for you." He felt a familiar sting of guilt. No matter how hard he worked, it never seemed to be enough. Not to buy more time, not to fix everything. He walked to his daughter's room and knocked softly before pushing the door open. "Hey, star player." Alara looked up from her book, eyes lighting up. "Dad!" Jace smiled, sitting at the edge of her bed. Even at 10 years old, she had the same sharp eyes and determined expression as her mother. The same love for basketball, too. Though, if he was being honest, she was already better than he had ever been. "You're all wet." She frowned. "Did you have to fix another car?" "Something like that." Alara leaned back against her pillows. "Was it a fancy one?" Jace chuckled. "Yeah, actually. Probably cost more than I make in 5 years." "Did they pay you a lot?" Jace hesitated for a second. "Nah." Alara's brows furrowed. "Why not?" Jace thought about it. He thought about how money had never been the reason to help someone. It was just what you did when someone was stranded, lost, or stuck. Because sometimes, you help people just to help, he finally said. Alara studied him for a moment before nodding. "That's what Mom used to say." His chest tightened. 3 years and it still felt like yesterday. "Yeah." His voice was softer now. "She did." Alara yawned, curling up under the blanket. "I want to be like that too." Jace kissed her forehead. "You already are, kid." He tucked her in, turning off the bedside lamp. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that in less than an hour, his world was about to burn to the ground. The smell of smoke woke him. At first, he thought he was dreaming. Then, the blaring alarm ripped through the apartment and suddenly it was real. Jace jumped out of bed, heart pounding. In the darkness, flames danced along the hallway walls, creeping toward the ceiling. "Alara!" Her door burst open before he could reach it, her small frame silhouetted by the fire's glow. She was coughing, eyes wide with fear. "Dad, we have to go. Now." Jace grabbed her hand, pulling her low to the floor. The air was thick, suffocating, the heat unbearable. People were screaming. Footsteps pounded in the halls as neighbors ran for the exits. Somewhere, glass shattered. Jace wrapped an arm around Alara, guiding her toward the stairwell. Flames licked at the walls, smoke curling around them like a living thing. The exit was barely visible through the haze. They ran. Bursting through the doors, they stumbled into the cold night air, gasping. Sirens wailed. Red and blue lights flashed. The entire second floor was engulfed now, flames tearing through apartments like paper. Alara clung to him, shaking. Jace turned to look at their home. Except it wasn't home anymore. It was gone. Their belongings, their pictures, the life he had built after Maria's death, gone, and he had no idea what to do next. The night after the fire, Jace sat on the edge of a stiff motel bed, staring at the peeling wallpaper. The room smelled faintly of bleach and stale air, the kind of place where people passed through, never staying long enough to call it home. It wasn't home, not even close. Alara lay curled on the other bed, her small body lost beneath the oversized motel blanket. She had cried herself to sleep hours ago, exhausted from the nightmarish escape. Jace had held her close outside the burning apartment, whispering assurances he wasn't sure he believed himself. Now, in the dim glow of the bedside lamp, reality pressed down on him like a crushing weight. The fire had taken everything: clothes, furniture, his father's old records, the framed picture of Maria that had always sat on the bookshelf. Gone. The emergency assistants had covered 1 week at this motel. 7 days to figure out what came next. 7 days to rebuild a life from nothing. His stomach twisted. There was no plan. Jace rubbed a tired hand down his face, glancing at the pile of donated clothes a volunteer had dropped off earlier. The sizes were all wrong. The shoes were too small for Alara. But beggars didn't get to be choosers. A deep exhaustion settled into his bones, heavier than anything he had ever felt. He needed sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Because tomorrow, he had one last thing to lose. The sun had barely risen when Jace parked his truck in front of Joe's auto shop. It was muscle memory at this point. Pull into the lot, grab coffee from the break room, clock in before Joe started yelling. Except today, the lot was fuller than usual. And the faces inside, unfamiliar. A bad feeling crawled up his spine as he stepped inside. Joe, his boss for the last 8 years, was waiting near the front desk, shifting uncomfortably. Jace, hey, can we talk? That was all it took. He didn't need to hear the rest. Still, he let Joe speak. The shop's been sold. The new owner is bringing in his own guys. I fought for you, man, I did, but they've got their own team. Jace swallowed, the words slow to sink in. You're letting me go. Joe's sigh was almost guilty. I don't have a choice. I'm sorry. Jace let out a breath, forcing the anger down. What was the point? It wouldn't change anything. Got any leads? His voice was steady, but the desperation cracked through the edges. Joe hesitated. I'll ask around. Jace gave a slow nod, then turned and walked out before Joe could say anything else. The morning air was cold, but not colder than the reality setting in. No home, no job, no savings. He climbed into his truck, resting his forehead against the steering wheel. How the hell was he going to tell Alara? The next day, Jace walked into a pawn shop carrying the only thing he had left of value, his father's toolbox. The metal case was scratched, the edges rusted in places, but it still held a lifetime of lessons. His dad's initials were carved into the side, a small, familiar mark of the man who had taught him everything he knew about fixing cars. The shopkeeper, a stocky man in a grease-streaked apron, eyed the box before unlocking the latch and inspecting the tools inside. These are quality, he admitted, but I can only give you 400, Jace interrupted, voice firm. The man gave him a long look. 250. Jace's jaw tightened. I know what these are worth. The shopkeeper sighed, scratching his chin. 350. Final offer. Jace wanted to argue, wanted to grab the box and walk out. But reality was cruel, and he didn't have the luxury of pride. Fine. The cash felt dirty in his hands, but he stuffed it into his pocket anyway. One more week at the motel. A little food. A little time. That was all this bought him. But time wouldn't be enough if he couldn't find a way out. Jace spent the next week searching for jobs. 27 applications, 3 callbacks, 0 offers. It was the same everywhere. Some places said he was too experienced for the entry-level roles. Others said they were looking for someone with more formal training. A few just never called back. The worst was the fast food restaurant. The manager, a kid who couldn't have been older than 22, had looked him over, frowning at his resume. You used to be a mechanic? Yeah. Why do you want to flip burgers? Jace had forced himself to smile. Because I need a job. The manager hadn't even bothered to hide his doubt. We'll keep your application on file. Jace had walked out knowing what that meant. Another dead end. Miles away, Michael Jordan sat in his high-rise office, a glass of water resting untouched on the sleek wooden desk. He should have been reviewing the quarterly reports for one of his businesses, but his attention kept drifting back to the man on the highway. Jace Carter. Michael leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping against the armrest. It had been a week, but something about that moment wouldn't leave him alone. He had looked Jace up, of course. With the kind of resources at his disposal, it hadn't been difficult. Jace Carter, 34 years old, skilled mechanic, single father. Lost his wife, Maria, 3 years ago. Then, 2 nights ago, lost his apartment in a fire. Michael had stared at the report for a long time, something tightening in his chest. You're thinking about the mechanic, aren't you? Michael glanced up. Diana Johnson, his longtime assistant, stood in the doorway, arms crossed. She had worked with him for years, long enough to know when something was on his mind. Michael exhaled, nodding. I don't know why, but yeah. Diana walked in, setting a folder down in front of him. This might help. Michael opened it. Inside were photos of the burned-down apartment complex, reports of the fire, a list of the displaced families, Jace and Alara Carter, currently living in a run-down motel on the west side of Chicago. Michael felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. He knew what it was like to have nothing, to feel like the world had stacked the odds against you. He had to do something. Michael leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. Where is he now? Diana glanced at her phone. According to our sources, still at the motel. He applied to a few places, but no luck. Michael's jaw clenched. He had been handed second chances before. Someone had believed in him when he was just a kid with a basketball and a dream. Now, it was his turn. He looked at Diana, the decision already made in his mind. Find a way to bring him here. Diana raised a brow. Are you offering him a job? Michael thought about it for a moment. Not just a job, he said finally. A way out. And with that, he set into motion something that would change both their lives forever. Michael's mind kept circling back to the same thought. The mechanic on the highway. The man who had stopped in the storm, fixed his tire, and refused a dime for his trouble. Jace Carter. Michael had met countless people throughout his career, from fans to business executives, but this one interaction wouldn't leave him. It gnawed at him, the way Jace had simply walked away, unfazed by money or status. That kind of person was rare. And now, thanks to Diana's research, Michael knew just how rare. Across from him, Diana Johnson placed a tablet on his desk and tapped the screen. A grainy security video played. It was footage from a gas station down the road from where Michael had been stranded that night. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m. On screen, the headlights of an old truck cut through the rain. The driver's side door opened, and Jace Carter stepped out. His clothes were soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead. He walked to the cashier window, exchanging a few words with the attendant before handing over a few crumpled bills. Diana fast-forwarded the footage. A minute later, Jace walked back to his truck, a single cup of gas station coffee in his hands. He sat in his truck for a long moment, steam curling from the lid, his shoulders slumping with exhaustion. Then, he started the engine and pulled onto the road. Michael leaned back in his chair. He stopped to help me in the pouring rain, then bought himself $1 coffee because that's all he could afford. Diana folded her arms, watching him carefully. And he still turned down your money. Michael exhaled, rubbing his jaw. He had no idea who I was, yet he still stopped. Diana picked up her tablet, tapping to a new screen. That's not all. She swiped through a series of documents, news reports, financial records, job listings. A fire department report appeared on the screen, the header in bold. Oakwood Apartments, residential fire incident report. Michael's stomach sank. Diana continued. His apartment burned down 2 nights after you met him. He and his daughter barely made it out. No renter's insurance, no savings. He was placed in a temporary shelter, but after that, he moved into a motel. Michael flipped through the pages, absorbing the details. The fire had started on the first floor, faulty wiring. The building was old, barely maintained. No one had died, but several families had been displaced. He clenched his jaw. Jace had already been struggling before this. Diana swiped again, this time to a job termination notice. And then, she added, the day after the fire, he lost his job. The auto shop was sold, and the new management replaced the staff. He's been applying for jobs, but no luck. Michael exhaled sharply, setting the tablet down. A week ago, Jace had helped him without a second thought. Now, the man had lost everything. The thought sat heavy in Michael's chest. Later that evening, Michael sat alone in his penthouse, staring out at the Chicago skyline. Normally, he enjoyed these moments of solitude. They gave him time to think, to strategize. But tonight, his mind was elsewhere. His life had always been structured, challenges met with a plan, obstacles handled with precision. But this was different. There was no business strategy for fixing a man's life. He reached for his phone and called Diana. Get me a meeting with him. Diana hesitated. Do you want me to tell him who it's with? Michael thought for a moment. No. He wasn't doing this for the spotlight. He wasn't doing it out of obligation. He was doing it because he had been that kid once, the one who just needed a shot. And if no one had given him a chance, he wouldn't be sitting here now. Michael Jordan always played to win. This time, he wasn't playing for himself. The cheap motel room smelled of stale air and desperation. Jace sat at the small wooden table near the window, staring at the classified ads on his phone. Another rejection email had landed in his inbox an hour ago. We regret to inform you. He didn't even bother finishing the sentence. The savings from pawning his father's toolbox had bought them another week in the motel. One more week before the clock ran out. He glanced at the bed where Alara was curled up, hugging her teddy bear. She was still asleep, her breathing soft and even. She deserved better than this. His phone buzzed, the number unfamiliar. Jace frowned and hesitated before answering. Yeah? A crisp, professional voice replied. Mr. Carter, my name is Diana Johnson. I work for someone who'd like to meet you. Jace sat up a little straighter. Who exactly are you calling for? There was a pause, then. I'm not at liberty to say over the phone, but I assure you this is a legitimate opportunity. Jace let out a sharp laugh. Yeah, no thanks. I'm not in the mood for scams today. Diana's voice remained steady. This isn't a scam. Mr. Carter, I know about the fire. I know you lost your job, and I know you've been trying to find work without success. Jace stiffened. How the hell did she know all that? Diana continued, sensing his unease. This is a real job offer, Mr. Carter. One that could change your situation completely. He frowned. Why me? What kind of job? That's something my employer will discuss with you directly. If you're interested, a car will pick you up tomorrow morning at 10. Jace rubbed his temple. It felt like a setup. People didn't just call struggling mechanics out of nowhere offering life-changing jobs. Thanks, but I'll pass. Diana sighed. Mr. Carter, if you change your mind, the offer stands. Jace ended the call and tossed the phone onto the table. He wasn't an idiot. Too good to be true. Everything always came with a price. The next morning, Jace woke up early, his stomach tight with uncertainty. He hadn't told Alara about the call. No point getting her hopes up over something that would probably turn out to be another dead end. By 9:45 a.m., he had gone through his usual routine. Check the job listings, scan his email for responses, come up empty. Then he saw Alara's sneakers near the door. The soles had nearly worn through. His chest tightened. Maybe, just maybe, he should hear them out. At 9:59 a.m., a sleek black town car pulled up outside the motel. The driver stepped out, dressed in a sharp black suit. Jace hesitated. It still felt like a mistake. But mistakes were something he could afford even less than risks right now. Sighing, he grabbed his jacket and stepped outside. Let's get this over with. The car weaved through Chicago's streets, heading toward the wealthier part of the city. The further they drove, the more out of place Jace felt. Skyscrapers loomed above, polished cars lined the streets, and everything screamed money. By the time they pulled up in front of a sleek glass high-rise, Jace was completely sure he was in the wrong place. The driver opened the door. Mr. Carter, right this way. Jace hesitated before stepping out. Everything about this felt surreal. Inside, a well-dressed receptionist greeted him before escorting him to a private elevator. He barely had time to register the surroundings before the elevator doors slid open, revealing a sprawling penthouse office with floor-to-ceiling windows. Jace stepped inside, his eyes drawn to the impossibly wide view of the Chicago skyline. And then he saw him. Standing by the windows, dressed in a tailored suit, was Michael Jordan. Jace's heart nearly stopped. He blinked, once then twice, just to make sure he wasn't hallucinating. Michael Jordan? What the hell was happening? Michael turned, giving him the same easy smile that millions had seen on television. Jace Carter, glad you decided to come. Jace opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Michael gestured toward a chair. Have a seat. Jace sat stiffly, his mind racing. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. Michael leaned forward, hands clasped. You're wondering why you're here? Jace exhaled sharply. Yeah, that would be nice to know. Michael nodded. A week ago, you stopped to help a stranger in the rain. You didn't know who I was. You didn't ask for anything. You just helped. Jace shifted. It was just a flat tire. Maybe, but it mattered. Michael studied him for a moment before continuing. I looked into you. I know about the fire. I know you lost your job. I know you've been trying to find work. Jace's jaw clenched. Look, I don't need charity. Michael chuckled. Good, because I'm not offering you charity. I'm offering you a job. Jace frowned. What kind of job? Michael leaned back. I own a collection of cars, high-end, classic, custom-built. I need someone to maintain them, someone I can trust. Jace stared at him. You want me to fix your cars? Michael nodded. Full-time position, good salary, benefits. Jace folded his arms. Why me? Michael didn't hesitate. Because you're the kind of person who helps without being asked. That's the kind of person I want working for me. Jace let out a slow breath. It sounded too good. Too easy. There had to be a catch. Jace shook his head. I appreciate the offer, but I can't accept. Michael blinked. Why not? Jace exhaled. Because this doesn't happen. Guys like me don't just get calls from billionaires offering them dream jobs. Michael smiled. You're right. It doesn't happen. But I'm making it happen. Jace stood. I don't buy it. Michael's expression remained calm. You think this is a setup? Jace laughed, but there was no humor in it. Either that, or you feel bad and want to do a good deed. Either way, I'm not taking a handout. Michael leaned forward. It's not a handout. It's a job. Jace shook his head. No such thing as a free lunch. Michael studied him, then nodded as if understanding. Okay. Jace frowned. That's it? Michael stood, offering his hand. That's it. Jace hesitated before shaking it. Michael smiled. If you change your mind, Diana has my number. Jace turned and walked out. By the time Jace reached the sidewalk, his mind was a mess. He had just turned down a once-in-a-lifetime offer. Why? Because it felt wrong? Because things like this didn't happen? Or because he was too afraid to believe they could? He looked up at the towering building, a weight settling in his chest. Had he just made the biggest mistake of his life? Alara lay curled up on the bed, her breathing soft and steady, the exhaustion of another, long, uncertain day having finally pulled her into sleep. She clutched her teddy bear close, the same one she had rescued from the fire. Jace exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face. He had turned down Michael Jordan. The weight of that decision hadn't fully hit him until now. The job offer had been too good, too perfect, too much like a dream, and he had spent his whole life knowing that dreams weren't for people like him. He had walked out of that high-rise office convinced he was making the smart choice. But now? Now, as he counted the last few crumpled bills from his pocket, as the reality of his motel debt pressed down on him like a ticking clock, doubt gnawed at him. He needed a miracle. Instead, all he had was a nearly empty wallet and a daughter who needed more than he could give. Michael Jordan sat in his penthouse, staring at his phone. He had expected Jace to be hesitant. He knew pride when he saw it. But walking away entirely. That had been unexpected, but Michael wasn't done. He had built his entire career on refusing to take no for an answer. Diana entered the office, tablet in hand, raising an eyebrow at his expression. He refused. Michael leaned back in his chair, exhaling. Yeah. Diana shook her head. Most people would have jumped at that offer. Michael smirked. That's exactly why he didn't. Jace isn't most people. Diana hesitated before speaking again. So what now? Michael's expression turned thoughtful. He needs to see this isn't just about him. It's bigger than that. Diana studied him for a moment before nodding. I'll set it up. Michael leaned forward, a slow smile forming. Good. And in the meantime, let's make sure he has a little more time. Jace was in the middle of yet another rejection email when the motel manager knocked on his door. He opened it to see Mr. Holloway, the gruff, no-nonsense owner of the place, standing with his arms crossed. We need to talk, Carter. Jace's stomach twisted. He braced himself for the worst. Had he run out of time? Holloway handed him a slip of paper. Jace took it, scanning the bold, "Paid in full" stamped across the motel ledger. His brows furrowed. "Wait, what?" Holloway huffed. "Some fancy lawyer called this morning. Said your debt's covered for the next 2 months." Jace's pulse pounded. "Who?" "Didn't say. Just said you're paid up." Holloway narrowed his eyes. "Got some powerful friends you didn't tell me about?" Jace stared at the paper, heart racing. There was only one person this could be. Michael Jordan. His jaw clenched. Of course Michael had gone behind his back. A mix of frustration and disbelief swirled in his chest. He hated the idea of being someone's charity case. But then he looked at Alara, still sleeping peacefully. 2 more months, a little more time to figure things out. Maybe he should have been angry. Maybe he should have refused the help. But all he could feel was relief. Michael sat across from the ESPN anchor, adjusting his jacket slightly as the cameras adjusted their focus. The interviewer smiled. "Michael, you've been involved in a lot of charity work over the years. But today, you're here to talk about something different. Small acts of kindness." Michael nodded. "That's right. We hear a lot about big charity efforts, $1 million donations. But sometimes, the biggest impact comes from simple, everyday kindness." The anchor leaned forward. "Can you share an example?" Michael's smile was subtle. "A few weeks ago, I was stranded in the middle of a storm. No phone signal, no help. And then someone stopped. A stranger. He changed my tire in the pouring rain, refused to take a single dollar for it, and just said one thing: help someone else someday." The anchor's eyebrows lifted. "That's incredible." Michael's voice softened slightly. What he didn't know was that a few days later, he lost everything: his home, his job, and he never asked for anything. Not even then. The anchor's expression turned serious. "Did you ever find out who he was?" Michael only smiled. "I did. And I plan to return that kindness in a way he never expected." Jace sat on the motel bed, flipping through the channels, half distracted. The day had been another dead end. More applications, more silence. Then his attention snapped to the screen. Michael Jordan's face filled the ESPN broadcast. Jace froze. He grabbed the remote, turning up the volume. "Sometimes, the biggest impact comes from simple, everyday kindness." Michael's voice was calm, steady, but the story he was telling. Jace's breath caught in his throat. It was him. The flat tire. The rain. The words he had said. Michael was telling his story, but he wasn't using Jace's name. Jace stared at the screen as Michael finished the interview with a quiet, meaningful smile. "I did. And I plan to return that kindness in a way he never expected." The interview ended, cutting to a commercial, but Jace sat frozen. He felt exposed. But more than that, he felt seen. The world didn't know it. Was him. But Michael did. Jace exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He had made a mistake. A big one. Without thinking, he grabbed his phone and scrolled to Diana's number. He hit call. The phone rang twice before she answered. "Mr. Carter." Jace took a deep breath. "Is the job still on the table?" There was a small pause before Diana replied. "I'll let Mr. Jordan know." When Diana stepped into Michael's office, he didn't even look up from his paperwork. "He called, didn't he?" Diana smirked. "You knew he would." Michael leaned back in his chair, a small, satisfied smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Pride's a funny thing. You can't force someone to take help, but you can make them see why they should." Diana folded her arms. "So, what do you want me to tell him?" Michael stood, stretching slightly. "Tell him to be at the garage tomorrow morning. He's got work to do." Diana nodded, already heading for the door. Just before she left, Michael added, almost as an afterthought, "And tell him, welcome to the team." Jace wiped his hands on a grease-streaked rag, stepping back to admire his work. The vintage 1967 Mustang fastback purred like a dream, the engine running smoother than it probably had in decades. The car had come in with a host of issues: clogged fuel injectors, worn-out gaskets, and a failing transmission. But now it was as good as new. Henry, the head mechanic, gave an approving nod. "I'll admit it, Carter. You're better than I thought. Jace smirked, tossing the rag onto the workbench. That's supposed to be a compliment? Henry chuckled. Yeah, don't let it go to your head. Jace had been working at Michael Jordan's private garage for a little over a month now, and every day, he still had moments where he couldn't believe it. The first few weeks had been an adjustment, going from barely scraping by in a motel to working on some of the rarest cars in the world. But once he put his hands on an engine, once he lost himself in the familiar rhythm of repairs, it all made sense again. This was what he was good at. He belonged here. And yet, something still gnawed at him. Every time Michael stopped by the garage, every time they talked, Jace felt like there was something unsaid, something bigger coming. Outside, the sun hung low over the city skyline as Jace pulled into the apartment complex Michael had set up for him and Alara. Before he could even take off his jacket, he heard the familiar thud-thud of a basketball. He stepped onto the small balcony, looking down at the court below. There they were, Michael and Alara. She was dribbling, her face scrunched up in pure determination as Michael stood beside her, nodding in approval. That's it. Control the ball, don't let it control you. Alara hesitated, then took a shot. The ball arced through the air and sank cleanly through the hoop. Yes, she cheered, pumping her fist. Michael clapped. That's what I'm talking about. Keep that form and you'll be unstoppable. Jace leaned against the railing, watching his daughter practically glow under Michael's encouragement. He hadn't seen her this happy in a long time. When Michael finally noticed him, he tossed the ball toward Alara. All right, kid. 10 more shots before you head inside. Alara nodded eagerly, already setting up for another shot. Michael jogged over, grabbing a water bottle from the bench. She's got talent. Jace chuckled. She's got your posters all over her walls, man. She's been studying your game since she could walk. Michael took a sip of water, his expression turning more serious. She reminds me of me at that age. She's got that fire. Jace exhaled. She just needs a real shot, someone to believe in her. Michael nodded slowly, but his gaze never left Jace. So do you. Jace frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Michael just smirked. You'll see. A few days later, Jace was working late at the garage, double-checking the alignment on one of Michael's Ferraris, when he heard voices from the adjacent office. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but when you hear your boss talking about you, it's hard to ignore. Diana's voice was crisp. Are you sure he's ready for this? Michael's reply was calm, certain. He's more than ready. Jace's stomach tightened. Ready for what? He strained to hear more. Diana sighed. He's going to think you're out of your mind. Michael let out a quiet laugh. Yeah, but I'll convince him. Jace stepped back from the door, a knot forming in his gut. His time here was up. That had to be it. Maybe Michael had just brought him in for a temporary favor, to get him back on his feet. Maybe this had never been meant to last. That night, he barely slept. The next morning, Jace walked into the garage expecting bad news. Instead, Michael was waiting for him, hands in his pockets, wearing that same unreadable expression. Come on, he said. I need to show you something. Jace frowned but followed as Michael led him outside. They climbed into a sleek black SUV, and within minutes they were driving through the city. Where are we going? Jace asked. Michael didn't answer. He just kept driving. 15 minutes later, they pulled up to an unfamiliar building, a newly renovated facility with a glass front and a large sign covered with a black cloth. Jace followed as Michael stepped out, walking toward the entrance. Inside, the place was buzzing with activity. People setting up desks, arranging chairs, moving stacks of paperwork. It looked like an office, but not like any business Michael had ever mentioned before. Michael finally turned to face him. This is what I've been working on. Jace glanced around. And what exactly is this? Michael took a deep breath. The Good Things Happen Foundation. Jace blinked. The what? Michael gestured toward the still-covered sign outside. It's a foundation designed to help working-class families recover from unexpected tragedies. Fires, medical emergencies, job loss. Real help when people need it most. Jace felt something tighten in his chest. Michael continued. You lost everything in that fire. And for weeks, no one stepped in. No one gave you a real way out. You had to fight for every inch, every meal, every breath. Jace swallowed, staring at the ground. He knew all of this. He had lived it. Michael's voice softened. What if there had been a place to go? A foundation that could step in and say, "We've got you. We'll help you get back on your feet." Jace looked up. For the first time, he understood. This wasn't about charity. It was about giving people a second chance, the same one Michael had given him. Michael studied him. "And I want you to run it." Jace froze. "What?" Michael smiled. "You heard me." Jace let out a dry laugh. "I'm a mechanic, Michael. I fix cars, not people." Michael shook his head. "No, Jace. You help people. You did it for me when I was stranded in that storm. You do it for your daughter every day. You know what it's like to have nothing and still keep fighting. That's the kind of person this foundation needs." Jace opened his mouth, then closed it. This was insane. He wasn't qualified for something like this. He didn't have a degree, didn't know the first thing about running a foundation. And yet, for the first time in a long time, he saw a future that wasn't just about surviving. It was about making a difference. Jace exhaled slowly. "You're serious about this?" Michael nodded. "Dead serious." Jace glanced around the building. He thought about Alara. Thought about the night he had pulled her from that burning apartment. Thought about every time he had felt like the world was working against him. Maybe he had needed this foundation once, and maybe now someone else needed it too. Jace looked Michael in the eye. "Okay," Michael smiled. "Okay?" Jace smirked. "Let's do this." And just like that, his life changed forever. Jace stood outside the Good Things Happen Foundation, staring up at the sign as the morning sunlight gleamed off the fresh lettering. The name still felt surreal to him. A few months ago, he had been scraping by in a motel room, watching his world crumble around him. Now he was about to step into a new role, one he never imagined himself in. The weight of responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders, but for the first time in years, it wasn't fear holding him down. It was purpose. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was about to change lives. Jace walked through the front doors, nodding to a few of the caseworkers as he passed. The office had only been open for a week, but the energy inside was already electric. Phones rang. Conversations hummed. People weren't just working, they were making things happen. Diana was waiting for him near his office, tablet in hand. "You ready for your first official day as director?" she asked, her tone somewhere between professional and amused. Jace let out a slow breath. "Not even close," Diana smirked. "Good. That means you'll do just fine." She handed him a folder. "Here's your first case." Jace opened it and scanned the file. A single mother, 2 kids, lost their home in a fire 3 weeks ago. His grip tightened on the folder. It was his story all over again. Diana's voice softened. "You should be the one to talk to her." Jace swallowed hard. He wasn't sure he was ready for this, but he knew better than anyone what it felt like to sit on the other side of that desk. So he nodded. "Send her in." A few minutes later, the door opened, and Samantha Reyes walked in, her 2 children trailing behind her. Jace could see it in her eyes immediately, the exhaustion, the worry, the quiet desperation of someone trying to hold it together for their kids. He stood, offering his hand. "Ms. Reyes, I'm Jace Carter. Please have a seat." She sat down cautiously, her arms wrapped protectively around her son and daughter. The boy looked around the office curiously, while the girl clutched a worn-out stuffed rabbit. Jace glanced at the file again. They had been bouncing between shelters, trying to find a permanent place to stay. Samantha cleared her throat. I don't even know where to start." Jace met her eyes. "Start at the beginning." She hesitated, then let out a shaky breath. "It happened so fast. One minute I was putting the kids to bed, the next the whole building was filled with smoke." Jace listened, nodding, but his mind was flashing back to that night. The way the fire had swallowed everything in minutes. The way he had carried Alara through the thick smoke, praying they'd make it out alive. He knew exactly what she had gone through. Samantha clenched her hands together. I don't know what to do. Every place I've applied to needs a deposit I don't have. The shelters are full. I have a job, but it's not enough to get us back on our feet. Her voice broke slightly, and she quickly wiped at her eyes. Jace leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. You don't have to do this alone. Samantha looked up, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. I know what it's like, Jace continued. A few months ago, I was where you are now. I lost everything in a fire. I was living in a motel with my daughter, trying to find a way out. Her breath hitched. Really? Jace nodded. Yeah. And someone gave me a shot when I didn't think I deserved one. He exhaled, sitting back. Now I'm giving you one. Samantha's fingers tightened on the arms of the chair. What does that mean? Jace smiled. It means your family is about to go home. An hour later, Jace stood outside a small but well-kept apartment complex on the city's west side. Michael had made sure the foundation had secured housing partnerships, so families like Samantha's wouldn't have to jump through endless bureaucratic hoops to find a home. Jace turned to Samantha, who was staring at the building in disbelief. Her son tugged at her sleeve. Mommy, is this our new house? Her voice trembled. I think it is. Jace pulled a key from his pocket and handed it to her. Welcome home. Samantha took the key with shaking hands. She looked at it like she couldn't quite believe it was real. Her daughter hugged her stuffed rabbit tighter, whispering, We don't have to sleep in the car anymore? Jace's throat tightened. Samantha pulled both of her kids close, nodding fiercely. No, baby, we don't. Then she looked up at Jace, tears spilling over her lashes. I don't know how to thank you. Jace smiled softly. Just help someone else someday. That evening, Jace walked into Michael's office, still processing everything that had happened. Michael glanced up from his desk. So, how'd it go? Jace let out a slow breath. They've got a home now. Michael nodded, satisfied. Good. Jace ran a hand through his hair. I didn't think I could do this. I still don't know if I can. Michael leaned back, studying him. You just changed a family's life, Jace. That's more than most people do in a lifetime. Jace shook his head. It's not enough. Michael smirked. Then keep going. Jace met his gaze. He had come full circle, from the man who needed help to the one giving it. And it felt right. He grinned. Yeah, I think I will. Michael stood, extending his hand. Welcome to the big leagues. Jace shook it, knowing that this was only the beginning. Jace stood outside the Good Things Happen Foundation, watching as another family stepped through the doors for help. A mother holding her child's hand, a father carrying a single bag with everything they owned. Their eyes filled with the same fear and uncertainty he had once felt. But now, they had a place to turn. He leaned against the railing, arms crossed, the weight of his journey settling over him. Months ago, he had been the one standing on the other side of those doors, unsure of where his life was headed. Now, he was the one opening those doors for others. Michael walked up beside him, hands in his pockets following his gaze. You did good, Jace. Jace huffed out a breath. I had a good teacher. Michael smirked. I know. They stood in silence for a moment, watching as caseworkers led families inside, helping them find housing, jobs, and a way forward. The ripple effect had begun. One act of kindness had turned into something so much bigger. Behind them, Alara jogged up the steps, basketball under her arm. She had been practicing every day, her determination relentless. She grinned at Michael. Coach, I think I've got my jump shot figured out. Michael chuckled. That's so? We'll see about that. Alara turned to Jace, her eyes shining. Just help someone else someday, right? Jace felt a warmth spread through his chest. He nodded, ruffling her hair. That's the plan. As they walked inside, the camera lingered on the foundation's sign, the doors swinging open once more. Because good things really do happen to good people. And it all started with one stormy night, one flat tire, and one man who simply chose to help. Some stories inspire, others ignite action. This isn't just a story, it's a reminder that one small act of kindness can change everything. Look around. Someone out there needs a second chance, a helping hand, a moment of hope. Be the reason their story takes a turn for the better. Because the greatest impact starts with a simple choice. Will you be the one to stop and help?